Security put their hands on her first. Not the doctors. Not the nurses. Security. Ada Bankole Coleman stood in the hallway outside room 412 of Meridian General Hospital, still in her work clothes, still holding the coffee she'd bought for a man who hadn't said thank you to her in 3 years, and watched 2 guards close ranks in front of a door she had walked through 100 times before she ever wore a wedding ring. Behind that door, a machine was breathing for a dying woman. And the man who put those guards there, the man who told them she is not family, do not let her in, was Ada's own husband. He didn't know what he'd just done. He didn't know whose hospital he was standing in. He didn't know that the woman he'd just had escorted out of a hallway like a trespasser had a name on a brass plaque 2 floors above his head, in a boardroom he'd never been invited to, in a building his mother's life now depended on. Marcus Coleman thought he was protecting his family. What he was actually doing was lighting a fuse under the one thing in his life he could never afford to lose. But to understand how a man ends up barring his own wife from his dying mother's bedside, you have to go back. Not to the hospital. Not even to the marriage. You have to go back to a little brick house on the edge of a city most people only visit for layovers, where a girl named Ada grew up believing her father drove a delivery truck for a living. Ada's father, Emmanuel Bankole, left the house every morning at 6 in a grey uniform with his name stitched over the pocket. He came home every evening smelling like diesel and asphalt, sat at the kitchen table, and helped Ada with her homework by lamplight because he said electricity bills were a young family's biggest thief. He fixed the leaking faucet himself. He drove a 14-year-old sedan with a cracked side mirror held together by duct tape. And every single Sunday, without fail, he took Ada to the free clinic 3 blocks from their house, where he volunteered stocking supply closets, and told her, "Whatever you become, baby girl, you remember what it feels like to wait in a room like this one, hoping somebody sees you." She remembered. She remembered so well that even after she grew up, even after she became a woman with a soft voice and sharper eyes than anyone gave her credit for, she still flinched a little every time she walked into a hospital, some old, inherited instinct telling her that people like her waited, they didn't walk in expecting anything. What Ada did not know, what almost no one knew, was that her father had not always driven a delivery truck. 26 years earlier, Emmanuel Bankole had founded a single community clinic with 3 borrowed exam rooms and a loan he was terrified he'd never repay. That clinic grew. And grew. And kept growing, quietly, methodically, folded inside layers of holding companies and private trusts that Emmanuel built specifically so his name would never appear on a headline. By the time Ada was in high school, her father's clinic had become Meridian Health Systems, a network of 19 hospitals and 40 clinics spanning 6 states, privately held, valued at just over $32 billion. And not one employee below the executive floor had ever seen his face. Emmanuel had watched too many founders' children grow up soft, entitled, orbiting money instead of meaning. He'd watched friends' families implode the moment a number got attached to their name. So he made a decision most people would call insane. He kept driving the delivery truck 3 days a week, not because he needed the income, but because he needed his daughter to grow up believing that work was who you were, not what padded your bank account. The truck was real. The uniform was real. The lesson was the point. There was only one person outside the company who knew the truth in those early years, a soft-spoken attorney named Desmond Whitfield, who had drafted every trust document Emmanuel ever signed and visited the Bankole house twice a year in an unremarkable navy sedan, never staying more than an hour, never explaining himself to a curious teenage Ada beyond, "Your father and I do business together." She used to imagine Desmond sold insurance. She had no idea he was the second most powerful person inside a $32 billion healthcare empire, and that everything inside it, eventually, would answer to her. When Emmanuel died, quietly, of a stroke in his sleep at 61, Ada was 29 years old and 3 years into a marriage that had already begun to rot from the inside, though she didn't fully know it yet. At the reading of the will, Desmond Whitfield sat her down alone, in a conference room with views of a city she'd lived in her whole life without ever knowing she owned a piece of it, and told her the truth in 4 sentences that rearranged her entire understanding of who her father had been. "Your father built something enormous," Desmond said. "He built it in silence on purpose. It's yours now, structured exactly the way he wanted, and no one in your life is to know unless you choose to tell them. He believed the world should love you before it ever finds out what you're worth. Ada didn't cry that day. She sat very still, the way her father used to sit still when he was thinking hard about something, and she asked Desmond only one question: "Does Marcus need to know?" Desmond had studied her for a long moment before answering. "Your father left specific instructions about that," he said, and I'm quoting him exactly. "Let her find out on her own who deserves the truth. Some people show you who they are long before you ever hand them a reason to." She'd married Marcus Coleman 4 years earlier, back when he still opened doors for her, back when his ambition looked like drive instead of hunger, back when his mother, Vivian, still hugged her at Thanksgiving instead of correcting the way she seasoned green beans. Marcus worked as a mid-level pharmaceutical sales rep, chasing a promotion that always seemed to land on someone else's desk. He was smart, restless, and increasingly convinced that the life he deserved was being withheld from him by everyone except himself. Ada, in his eyes, had become part of the withholding. A woman with a modest salary as a hospital administrative coordinator, driving a used hatchback, splitting rent, was not, in Marcus's private calculations, someone building him toward anything. She was, he began to believe, someone holding him back. He never knew that the job she went to every day, the administrative coordinator position at a Meridian-affiliated clinic, was one she'd taken under her mother's maiden name specifically so no one would connect her to the empire she quietly inherited and had chosen, for now, not to touch. She wanted, more than anything, to be loved for exactly who she was without a dollar sign attached to it. It was the same wish her father made for her before she was even born. It would turn out to be the most expensive gift he ever gave her, and the most dangerous one. The cruelty didn't arrive all at once. It arrived the way water arrives in a basement during a slow leak, one drop at a time, until one day you're standing ankle deep and can't remember when it started. It started with comments. "You could dress up more for my work dinners." Then it became correction. "You don't need to talk so much when my colleagues are around, Ada, let me handle the conversation." Then Vivian moved in temporarily after a minor health scare, and temporarily became permanent, and permanent became a woman rearranging Ada's kitchen cabinets and telling anyone who'd listen that her son had married beneath his potential. "He could have had a woman with real ambition," Vivian said once, loud enough to carry through the thin apartment walls to where Ada stood folding laundry. "Instead he settled for someone who answers phones for a living." Ada said nothing. She had been raised by a man who wore a delivery uniform on top of a fortune and never once raised his voice to prove a point. Silence, to her, wasn't surrender. It was inheritance. But Marcus mistook her silence for weakness, the way small men often do, and he pushed harder because nothing ever pushed back. He stopped coming home for dinner. He started staying late for work, though the excuses grew thinner with each passing month. He compared her, out loud, at family gatherings, to women he worked with who wore the right labels and knew the right restaurants. He told her, more than once, that she was lucky to have him, that most men wouldn't have stayed with someone so plain, so unremarkable, so content with so little. She let the words land and kept working her quiet, unremarkable job at a hospital that, unbeknownst to everyone at that dinner table, she technically controlled. Around that same time, a new district sales manager transferred into Marcus's office, a sharp-edged woman named Priya Kessler who wore her ambition the way other people wore perfume, impossible to miss and designed to linger. She laughed too loudly at Marcus's jokes in the break room. She lingered near his desk after meetings. She told him, within her first month, that she could already tell he was destined for more than a regional sales floor, and Marcus, starving for anyone who seemed to see the version of himself he believed he deserved to be, drank in every word of it. He started angling for reasons to work late alongside her. He started mentioning her name at dinner in a tone just a little too casual to be accidental. Ada noticed, the way a person always notices whether changing before a storm actually arrives, and said nothing, because she had learned by then that naming a thing before it was ready to be named only gave a man an excuse to deny it. The first time Priya showed up at a family dinner, Marcus introduced her as someone from the office who's been a huge help lately, and Vivian, who had barely acknowledged Ada in months, lit up like a woman greeting a long-lost relative. She asked Priya about her career trajectory. She refilled Priya's wine glass before Ada's water. She told a story about Marcus's childhood that Ada had heard a dozen times, but told it that night with a warmth she hadn't aimed in Ada's direction since the wedding. Ada sat at the end of her own table, in the home she paid half the rent on, and watched a stranger get treated like the daughter-in-law she had never once been allowed to be. When she finally excused herself to the kitchen, Marcus followed a few minutes later, not to check on her, but to ask, quietly and with real irritation, why she seemed off in front of his guest. "She's not a guest, Marcus," Ada said. "She's someone you invited into our home to watch how little I mean to you." He rolled his eyes and walked back to the table without answering. Then Vivian got sick. It started as fatigue Vivian brushed off as getting older, then chest pain she waved away as heartburn, then, one Tuesday morning, a collapse in her own kitchen that landed her in an ambulance and, within 72 hours, a diagnosis that turned the whole family's axis. Advanced congestive heart failure, complicated by a rare valve condition that most hospitals in the region weren't equipped to treat. Vivian needed specialized cardiac intervention. Fast. And in the entire metro area, there was exactly one hospital with both the surgical team and the experimental valve repair program capable of giving her a real chance. Meridian General, flagship of the very system Ada's father had built from nothing and left, in full, to his daughter. Marcus didn't know that. All he knew was that his mother was dying and the woman he'd spent 3 years treating like an afterthought suddenly had something he desperately needed: access. Ada worked, as far as he understood it, in hospital administration. So the night Vivian was admitted, grey-faced and struggling to breathe in the back of an ambulance, Marcus turned to his wife in the hospital parking lot and said the first genuinely urgent sentence he'd spoken to her in over a year. "You work here. Pull some strings. Get her the best doctor in the building." Ada didn't correct him. Not yet. She simply nodded, walked inside, and quietly made a call that, had Marcus known who was on the other end, would have stopped him cold in his tracks. For the first 2 weeks, it looked almost like the marriage might survive the crisis. Marcus was scared, and scared men sometimes remember how to be soft. He held Ada's hand in waiting rooms. He thanked her for showing up early, staying late, ferrying Vivian's paperwork between departments with an efficiency that, if he'd been paying closer attention, should have raised more questions than it did. What Marcus never noticed, because he was never looking, was the way certain senior staff seemed to straighten slightly when Ada walked past. The way a floor director once addressed her, by mistake, as Ms. Bancolet instead of Mrs. Coleman, and Ada had smiled tightly and said nothing, and the floor director had gone pale and apologized twice. Then Vivian's condition worsened, and Marcus's fear curdled, the way it so often does in men who have never learned to sit inside discomfort without assigning someone else the blame for it. The cardiac team recommended an experimental valve procedure, still in a limited trial phase, available at Meridian General to a small number of patients per year, reviewed and approved case by case through a private philanthropic fund that covered costs insurance wouldn't touch. It was, in every sense, Vivian's best and possibly only shot. Getting approved for that fund required paperwork, medical review, and, quietly, a final sign-off from someone on the hospital's governing board, a board whose chair nobody outside a small circle of executives had ever met in person. Marcus, terrified and desperate to feel useful, decided the delay in approval was Ada's fault. "You work here," he snapped at her in the family lounge, loud enough that 2 other families glanced over. "You're supposed to know people. Why is this taking so long? Is this because of you? Did you say something? Did you do something?" Ada, holding a paper cup of vending machine coffee she hadn't touched, felt something in her chest go very quiet and very still, the same stillness her father used to carry into rooms full of louder men. "I'm handling it, Marcus," she said. "Handling it," he repeated, and laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You handle phone calls, Ada. You don't handle anything that matters." Lorraine, no, Vivian, watching from her hospital bed through the cracked door, nodded along with her son's cruelty the way she always had, too weak to raise her voice but not too weak to add, in a rasp barely above a whisper. "Maybe if you'd married someone with real connections, we wouldn't be waiting on strangers to decide whether I live." Ada set the coffee down on the windowsill. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She walked out of the family lounge, down the hallway, into the elevator, and up to the 9th floor, where a door with no nameplate and a keypad lock led to an office that, if Marcus had ever seen the inside of it, would have ended every assumption he'd ever made about his wife in about 4 seconds. That night, for the first time in nearly a year, Ada picked up a phone and called Desmond Whitfield directly. "I need the review expedited," she said. "Not because of who's asking. Because the patient needs it. Approve it on medical merit. I don't want my name anywhere near the file." "Understood," Desmond said. Then, after a pause, "Ada, how much longer are you going to let him talk to you like that?" She didn't answer that question. Not yet. The procedure was approved 2 days later, and Marcus, predictably, took the credit for himself, telling Vivian he'd made calls, pulled favors, handled it, standing a little taller in front of the nursing staff, never once wondering why the nurses exchanged a look every time he said it. The surgery went well. Vivian survived, stabilized, began the long climb back toward strength. And exactly when gratitude should have softened Marcus, it did the opposite. Relief, in men like him, doesn't produce humility. It produces amnesia. Within a week of his mother's surgery, Marcus was back to treating Ada like scenery, someone who existed to keep the household running while he resumed complaining about a life he felt he was owed and hadn't yet received. Then came the morning that put security between Ada and her own husband's family. Vivian had a setback, a minor post-surgical infection that required close monitoring, and the family had been asked to limit visitors to reduce infection risk, immediate family only, hospital policy, standard and reasonable. Marcus took that policy and twisted it into a weapon. "You're not blood," he told Ada flatly, standing in the hallway outside room 412, arms crossed, blocking her path the way a man blocks a doorway he has no legal right to control. "You're my wife, not my mother's daughter. The hospital said immediate family only, and that's not you. Not right now. Not with everything going on." "Marcus," Ada said, and for the first time in 3 years, there was something in her voice that made him actually stop and look at her. "I have been coming to this hospital every single day for 3 weeks. I have handled every piece of paperwork your family couldn't manage. I sat with your mother the night before her surgery because you had a work thing. I am not asking to see a stranger. I am asking to see the woman who has spent 3 years telling me I'm not good enough for her son." "This isn't up for debate," Marcus said. And then, loud enough for the nurse's station to hear, loud enough for it to become a scene instead of a private disagreement, he said the sentence that would end up costing him more than he could possibly imagine in that moment. "Security. She's not on the approved list. Please escort her out." 2 guards, following policy they had no reason to question, stepped between Ada and the door. One of them, a younger man named Trent who had worked at Meridian for exactly 4 months, reached for Ada's arm to guide her toward the elevator, the way he'd been trained to do with any unauthorized visitor causing a disturbance on a restricted floor. Ada didn't fight him. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at Marcus, standing there with his arms crossed and his jaw set, so certain he had just won something, and said 5 quiet words that he wouldn't understand the weight of until it was far too late to take them back. "You have no idea, Marcus." Then she let the guard walk her to the elevator, and she rode it down alone, and by the time the doors opened on the lobby, she had already dialed Desmond Whitfield's number for the 2nd time that week. "I'm ready," she said, when he picked up. "Tell the board I'm coming in tomorrow. In person. Everyone needs to know exactly who's walking through this building." What happened the next morning at Meridian General Hospital would be talked about on that campus for years. Ada arrived at 8 a.m., not in scrubs, not in the modest blazer she wore to her quiet administrative job, but in a charcoal suit Desmond had insisted she order specifically for this moment, tailored, understated, unmistakably expensive in the way that real money always is, quiet. She walked through the main entrance, past the volunteer desk where she used to sign people in as a favor during her first year working there, past the gift shop, toward the private elevator bank that required a badge she'd never once used publicly. The moment she badged in, something shifted in the building's rhythm, the way a room changes when the right frequency finally hits it. A junior administrator glanced up, did a double take, and immediately reached for a phone. By the time Ada stepped off the elevator on the executive floor, the hospital's CEO, Dr. Patricia Renwood, was already standing in the hallway to greet her personally, hand extended, voice carrying the particular formality reserved for people who sign your paycheck. Ms. Bancole, we weren't expecting you in person today. I know, Ada said. I need eyes on room 412. Immediate family visitor restrictions have been misapplied by a family member, and I want it corrected within the hour, quietly, without drawing attention to anything beyond the correction itself. Dr. Renwood didn't ask a single follow-up question. She simply nodded and picked up her phone. Marcus found out the way most people find out they've made the biggest mistake of their life. Publicly, suddenly, and with absolutely no way to control the narrative. He was in the family lounge on the 4th floor, arguing with a nurse about extending visiting hours for his mother, when Dr. Renwood herself walked in, flanked by 2 staff members, and asked, in front of everyone, "Mr. Coleman, I understand there was a restriction placed on Ms. Bancole's access yesterday. I want to personally apologize. That was a significant error, and it's being corrected immediately." "Who's Ms. Bancole?" Marcus asked, genuinely confused, the name meaning nothing to him yet. Dr. Renwood's expression flickered with something close to disbelief. "Your wife, Mr. Coleman." The room went very quiet. Somewhere behind him, a vending machine hummed. A nurse near the doorway stopped mid-step, sensing the shift in the air the way people always do right before something in a room breaks open for good. Marcus laughed, the confused, reflexive laugh of a man whose brain hasn't yet accepted what his ears just told him. "My wife's name is Ada Coleman. She works in scheduling." "Your wife," Dr. Renwood said slowly, choosing each word with visible care, "is Ada Bancole. She is the majority shareholder and acting chairwoman of Meridian Health Systems. This hospital, along with 18 others and 40 clinics across this region, exists because her father built it and left it to her. She has held that position for the last 3 years, Mr. Coleman. She has been standing in this building the entire time your mother has been a patient here." Marcus's mouth opened. Nothing came out. He looked at the nurse beside him, then at his mother's room down the hall, then back at Dr. Renwood, searching her face for some sign that this was a joke, a mistake, anything other than what it was. It was not a mistake. He didn't move for almost a full minute. He simply stood there, staring at Dr. Renwood as though she might, at any second, admit it was all some elaborate misunderstanding. She didn't. Instead, she excused herself politely, leaving him alone in a hallway that suddenly felt much longer than it had 5 minutes earlier. Every framed photograph on the wall, every donor plaque, every piece of hospital signage he had walked past 100 times without reading, now looking to him like evidence he had somehow missed for 3 straight years. He thought about every dinner where he'd corrected the way Ada spoke in front of guests. Every time he'd told her she was lucky to have him. Every night he'd stayed late at the office instead of coming home to a woman who, it turned out, could have bought the office, the building it sat in, and the parking lot outside it without noticing the dent in her accounts. The shame arrived slower than the shock, but it arrived heavier, settling into his chest like something with real weight. He found Ada 20 minutes later, standing outside room 412, calmly reviewing his mother's chart with the head of cardiology, a woman she now realized had been treating a patient inside a hospital that legally, financially, and structurally belonged to her the entire time. Marcus approached with the frantic, unsteady energy of a man watching the floor tilt beneath him. "Ada. Ada, what is going on? Is this real? Is what she said real?" Ada closed the chart gently and handed it back to the cardiologist before turning to face him, and there was no anger in her expression, which somehow made it worse for him. There was only a terrible, settled calm. "You had me removed from a hallway yesterday," she said. "By security. In front of nurses I've known for years. Because you decided I wasn't family enough to see the woman who spent 3 years telling me I wasn't good enough for you." She paused, letting the silence stretch long enough for him to feel every second of it. "I let you believe I was small, Marcus, because my father raised me to want to be loved before I was ever respected for what I owned. I wanted, once in my life, to know someone chose me without a price tag attached. You had 3 years to choose me. You chose to have me thrown out of a hallway instead." "I didn't know," Marcus said, and his voice cracked on the word no, the particular crack of a man realizing, all at once, that ignorance was never going to be a defense that could save him. "If I had known." "That's exactly the problem," Ada said quietly. You needed to know before you could treat me like I mattered. My father never needed anyone to tell him what someone was worth. He just watched how they treated people when they thought no one important was looking. She walked past him, into room 412, and sat beside Vivian's bed the way she had every single day for 3 weeks, holding a hand that had never once, not on a single occasion, held hers back with any warmth. Vivian, weak, wired to monitors, stared up at her daughter-in-law with an expression caught somewhere between fear and disbelief. You're the owner, Vivian rasped. You're the one who paid for all of this. I'm the reason you're alive, Ada said, and there was no cruelty in the way she said it, only fact, laid down as plainly as her father used to lay down a tool on a workbench. Not because I wanted credit. Because it was the right thing to do, regardless of how your family has treated me. That's the difference between us, Vivian. I don't need someone suffering to prove they deserved help. She stayed another 20 minutes, checking on Vivian's vitals with the cardiologist, ensuring the recovery plan was airtight, and then she left the room, left the floor, left the building, and did not come back that week, or the next. What happened to Marcus in the months that followed unfolded with the particular, unhurried cruelty of consequences finally catching up to a man who had spent years outrunning them. Word travels fast inside a hospital system, and it travels even faster once it leaves one. Within days, quiet conversations were happening in break rooms and executive offices about the man who'd had the chairwoman of Meridian Health Systems physically removed from a hallway because he didn't consider her family enough. Nobody fired him from anything, because he didn't work there, but the story didn't need corporate consequences to spread. It spread through friends of friends, through his own pharmaceutical company's sales representatives who had contacts inside Meridian, through a Facebook post from a nurse who'd witnessed the whole thing and, without naming names, described watching a man humiliate his own wife in a hospital hallway, only to find out days later she owned the building. The post went semi-viral in local circles. People who knew Marcus began to recognize themselves, then him, in the comments. His mother's recovery, ironically, was the thing that finally broke whatever was left between them. Vivian, once strong enough to speak freely again, didn't apologize to Ada. She didn't reach out. Instead, she told anyone who would listen a revised version of events in which she had always known Ada was special, a claim so transparently false that even Marcus, listening from the next room, felt something in him curdle with disgust at his own mother for the first time in his life. He realized, watching her rewrite history in real time, that he had learned his cruelty from somewhere, and it wasn't a mystery where. Ada filed for divorce 6 weeks later. She didn't do it publicly. She didn't do it vindictively. She had Desmond handle it with the same quiet efficiency her father had handled everything. No interviews, no statements, no headlines, just paperwork moving through the correct channels while she went back to the work that actually mattered to her. Marcus tried, several times, to reach her directly, first with apologies, then with anger when the apologies didn't work, then with a long, rambling voicemail insisting he would have treated her differently if he'd only known. She never called back. Because that, more than anything else, was the sentence that told her everything she needed to know. Not I'm sorry for how I treated you. Just I would have treated you differently if I'd known you were worth something. He had never been sorry for the cruelty itself. He was only sorry he hadn't known who he was being cruel to. Priya Kessler, predictably, evaporated the moment the story reached the sales floor. The same woman who had spent months telling Marcus he was destined for more suddenly had no time for his calls, no interest in his texts, and a very convenient new assignment in another region that kept her permanently out of his path. Marcus told himself it was coincidence. Everyone else in the office knew better. A man who had just been publicly humiliated for treating a billion-dollar heiress like an inconvenience was not, in Priya's calculations, a man worth being seen with anymore. She had never wanted Marcus. She had wanted whatever version of success she thought he was standing next to. The moment that version disappeared, so did she. Marcus lost his sales position 4 months later, not because of the scandal directly, but because a man distracted by shame and public humiliation stops closing deals, stops showing up sharp, starts making the kind of small mistakes that compound into a performance review nobody wants to have. He moved into a smaller apartment. Vivian, fully recovered thanks to a procedure she never once thanked Ada for by name, moved in with a sister 2 states away, and the calls between mother and son grew shorter and further apart, the way relationships built on shared cruelty toward someone else often do once that someone else is no longer around to unite them. Ada, meanwhile, did something her father would have been quietly, deeply proud of. She didn't disappear into the wealth she'd inherited. She didn't buy a mansion or trade her modest sedan for something flashier. She stepped, fully and publicly for the first time, into her role as chairwoman of Meridian Health Systems, and she used that first year to launch something her father had sketched out on a legal pad decades earlier but never lived to build. A foundation providing free specialized cardiac care to families who couldn't afford it, named quietly, without ceremony, after a man who spent 30 years pretending to drive a delivery truck so his daughter would grow up knowing the difference between being valuable and being valued. She kept working out of the same modest office on the 9th floor, kept the same badge photo from her administrative coordinator days pinned to the corner of her desk as a reminder, kept a framed photo of her father in his grey delivery uniform on the shelf behind her chair, right next to a small brass nameplate that had once sat outside room 412, the one that read immediate family only, which she'd asked maintenance to remove and give to her, not out of bitterness, but as a private, permanent reminder of exactly what that phrase had once cost her, and exactly what it meant now that she got to decide, for the rest of her life, who truly belonged in the room. On the 1-year anniversary of her father's death, Ada drove out to the old brick house on the edge of the city, the one with the leaking faucet he'd fixed himself and the kitchen table where he'd helped her with homework by lamplight. She sat on the front steps as the sun went down, the same way she used to sit there as a girl waiting for the delivery truck to pull into the driveway, and she thought about the lesson he'd given her without ever once explaining it out loud, that the people who truly love you will treat you the same whether you own 19 hospitals or answer phones for a living, and the ones who don't will show you exactly who they are long before you ever hand them a reason to change. She never regretted keeping the truth to herself for as long as she did. Not because it protected her fortune. Because it protected something far more valuable, the clearest, most honest view of another person's character she would ever get to see, freely given, with nothing at stake but who they chose to be when they thought no one important was watching. Inside her office on the 9th floor, long after that first anniversary, Ada kept one more object on her desk, something she never explained to visitors and never needed to. It was a small, laminated visitor badge from her very first week working at the clinic under her mother's maiden name, the plastic edges worn soft from years in her coat pocket. People who noticed it usually assumed it was sentimental clutter, the kind of thing executives keep to seem relatable. It wasn't clutter. It was a compass. Every time a decision in front of her got complicated, every time a family without connections or money or influence needed a chance the system wasn't built to give them, she looked at that badge and remembered exactly what it felt like to be the person waiting in the room, hoping somebody with power would choose to see her. Some people will only respect you the moment they discover what you're worth on paper. But the ones who matter, the ones worth keeping in your life, already knew. Long before any door had a name on it, long before any hallway needed a guard, they were already treating you like family. If this story moved something in you, take a second to like the video and subscribe for more. And remember, the truth about who someone really is doesn't need a spotlight to reveal itself. It just needs enough time.